Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. This is Bridge City News. Here are some of the top stories we've been following. Trump's administration moves to end affirmative action in federal contracting and cut DEI staff. Plus, legislative reporter Tyler Dawson discusses Premier Smith's defense of Alberta amid tariff threats. And a frigid storm blankets New Orleans with snow.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Jeanette Roche.
Thanks so much for joining us. Liberal leadership candidates Mark Carney and Chandra Arya have submitted their paperwork to enter the race ahead of tomorrow's deadline. The two appear to be the first through the gate, submitting the required signatures and a $50,000 deposit. Candidates have until Thursday at 5 p.m. to get their deposit in, along with a written nomination with signatures of 300 registered Liberals. Karina Gold is planning on getting her papers and deposit in by the deadline, while Chrystia Freeland's campaign did not respond to inquiries. Two more candidates also declared their intention to enter the race today, including former Brampton MP Ruby Dalla and Michael Clark, a self-described Christian community organizer and businessman who is campaigning to, quote, make the party pro-life. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation has released the results from their annual survey. Its aim was to hear from Canadians what their priorities are for 2025. The survey found that 91% want to reverse the capital gains tax hike, 94% want to scrap the carbon tax, 72% want to defund the CBC, 97% oppose a home equity tax, and 93% say government bureaucrats need a salary cut. Arlene Dickinson, star of the show Dragon's Den and a member of the Canada-U.S. Relations Advisory Council, says her former co-star Kevin O'Leary does not speak for Canada with the Trump administration. She also urges Alberta Premier Danielle Smith to put the interests of Canadians first in negotiations with the U.S. president. Smith has refused to get on board with the Team Canada approach unless the federal government exempts energy from its retaliation plans.
I don't know that it's helpful. I don't believe it is. I mean, Kevin O'Leary isn't authorized to speak on behalf of Canadians, and I frankly don't believe he is speaking on behalf of Canadians with what he's saying. I mean, if he was negotiating on our side, I think that would be, totally fine, but he's not. He's negotiating against us, so I don't think it's a helpful solution right now.
It seems that there's maybe one person missing at the table. It's a big province, Alberta, Danielle Smith. What do you think about how she's been playing the game right now?
I'm an Albertan. I think that it's really important that we all speak together as one voice. In this situation, this isn't about any provincial interests. This is about the interests of us as a nation. And I think it's incredibly important that we absolutely negotiate as one nation together.
Well, as we know, Canada is divided in its plan to deal with the impending U.S. tariffs. A huge point of contention is Canada's energy exports to the U.S. There has been talk of Ottawa placing an export tax on Alberta oil and gas, which would direct money to Ottawa, not Alberta. So the province is looking to create a public body that would buy all private oil and gas intended for export to the U.S., protecting Alberta from the federal export tax. As one Canadian government cannot tax another. Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, gives us the details.
It is true that the government can't tax things, twice, basically. It's less clear, I think, whether or not that would apply in this case, as in, does the Alberta government simply declaring all this oil is theirs, does that exempt them from federal taxation powers? It would not surprise me to see some of these sort of attempts made by the Alberta government. I don't think it's clear cut that that's going to succeed. But then, you know what, from a political perspective in Alberta, that doesn't necessarily matter. I mean, maybe from a business and economics perspective, that stuff really matters. But at least part of what Danielle Smith needs to do is to be seen standing up for Alberta's largest industry.
Coming up later in the show, Tyler Dawson will also give us an update about the UCP lifting the moratorium on coal exploration in the Rocky Mountains. Well, Donald Trump's recent threats to impose tariffs on several countries, including Canada, continue to generate reactions among Canadian political experts. Lars Holstrom, professor of political science at the University of Lethbridge, explains what would happen if Trump followed through on that threat, especially in the economic area of southern Alberta.
Albertans, of course, are worried about the permanency of oil and gas as a revenue stream for the province. So if we see declining revenues, that's going to trigger probably a deficit budget for us. So, of course, it makes sense to prioritize the Albertan interest and the Albertan industrial interest, even if it means not necessarily playing in full kit with Team Canada. Let's remember, Donald Trump is a bit unpredictable in terms of what he actually does. He says a lot, he's signed a lot, but we don't actually know where things will play out, including some of the constitutionality and some of the legality of his own actions. So I think the sense of the premiers is largely we need to play as a country. Alberta has a lot of skin in a slightly different game, as do a few of the other provinces. And so we'll want to see how that balance of diplomacy and the art of the deal, which is playing to Donald Trump's particular oeuvre and book, as opposed to do we stand up, and I don't like the language of stand strong, but do we sort of draw the line in the sand around how we're going to respond to those tariffs as a national economy?
The tariff is 25% on everything imported to the U.S. from Canada and could be coming in as soon as February the 1st. Newly elected MLA for Lethbridge West, Rob Miyashiro, was sworn into the legislature Monday after winning the Lethbridge West by-election in December. Miyashiro will now serve the NDP caucus in his new role as senior advisor for the nonprofit sector. Miyashiro spoke with BCN about what it was like being introduced to the legislature for the first time.
You know, I'm more excited about it now almost than I was kind of nonchalant before, thinking, oh, this will be over in a few minutes, and then we can just meet with friends and family and caucus. And when the lieutenant governor is speaking directly to me and my family, and the speaker is speaking directly to me and my family about the responsibilities and about the journey we're embarking on, it was very special and almost overwhelming to me. At one point, I realized, this is for me, and because the other MLAs, when they get sworn in en masse, it's not the same kind of intimate gathering. So yeah, very fortunate to be able to experience that. Excited about being up in Edmonton. A little bittersweet about leaving my position at LSEO, but very excited to get started in my role.
In related news, Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi expects to be officially nominated as the NDP's candidate for the Edmonton Strathcona riding after former Premier Rachel Notley officially stepped down as MLA on December the 30th. The Lethbridge Public Library is expanding access to the community by introducing a temporary pop-up book stop inside the Labour Club Ice Centre. Residents with a valid library card can check out and return books at the arena that is completely self-service. The library says they may plan to bring in more book stops or a permanent option in the city if this trial project is popular in the community.
The library partnered with City of Lethbridge Recreation and Culture. We really wanted to find a location that people were already visiting in the city. We really wanted to explore co-location opportunities because, again, our goal is really to provide access, and so we want to be where people already are. We're focusing on the north side because the north side was identified in the library's facilities master plan as an underserved area in the city. So it's really our first priority is to see how we can better serve north side residents.
The book stop at Labour Club Ice Centre will remain up until mid-April, but an extension into summer is also being considered. Fire codes exist to protect people in their homes, workplaces, and public places. After the fires in Los Angeles, many began thinking about building codes. The Lethbridge Fire and Emergency Services Chief Troy Hicks says there are federal buildings and federal codes. Hick also says each province develops its own codes based on the federal code. He explains how the process works in Alberta and in Lethbridge.
So Alberta does have a national fire code and a national building code, Alberta edition. These are the codes that are used. The building code is a code that is used when developing new properties, new infrastructure. It does take into effect the fire code as well, but that's for the building code. And then what happens is once the building is built and occupied, then the fire code takes effect. So the fire code is like a maintenance manual. It's what gives myself and all of our inspectors the rules of what we're supposed to look for, what type of safety systems are supposed to be maintained and how they're supposed to be maintained, what kind of storage we can have in these buildings. So the fire hydrants here in the city, same thing, they are built up to code. There is a code that will say the requirement for how many hydrants have to be. There is a listing on how close a fire hydrant has to be to a private property, how close it has to be to a business. And there's also, these hydrants are tested annually to make sure they are given off the right flow, that if we show up with our fire trucks or any of our apparatus we hook up, we are going to have the water there we need.
According to Stats Canada, the National Fire Code establishes fire protection requirements for the safe use and maintenance of buildings, including references to design and construction. Well, south of the border, it didn't take him long, but President Donald Trump on Monday pardoned, commuted the prison sentences, or vowed to dismiss the cases of all 1,500 plus people charged with crimes in the January 6, 2021 takeover of the U.S. Capitol building.
A full presidential pardon, that's what we got. Nobody gets those, people like me. I'm just a working man, dude. People like us don't get presidential pardons because we don't donate. You know, in the past years, I'm not saying it's all corrupt, but it's mostly corrupt. Hunter Biden got a presidential pardon, you know what I'm saying? And people are freaking out about us getting a presidential pardon.
Immigrants in large U.S. cities have been preparing for mass arrests since Trump won the election back in November. He signed an executive order Monday declaring a national emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border, causing all illegal entry to be immediately halted and beginning the return of millions of what he referred to as criminal aliens. Aaron Ortiz Santos, an Atlanta-based lawyer who specializes in immigration cases, says many of his clients have been anxious.
Even if they are DACA holders, TPS holders, they have a work permit, they are afraid. They are worried about to stop the TPS or close the DACA, or what if we have another situation, they can stop or cancel my work permit. Part of the problem is that here in Georgia, it's unlawful driving without license since 2008. So that is a criminal fact that we face all the time. Previous years, anti-immigrant sheriffs use that as a tool to profile us, to put on hold immigration and start process to being deported.
President Donald Trump's administration is moving to end affirmative action in federal contracting and is directing that all federal diversity, equity, and inclusion staff be put on paid leave and eventually be laid off. The Associated Press has more on this story.
The move follows an executive order Trump signed on his first day, ordering a sweeping dismantling of the federal government's diversity and inclusion programs that could touch on everything from anti-bias training to funding for minority farmers and homeowners. That step is the first salvo in an aggressive campaign to upend DEI efforts nationwide, including leveraging the Justice Department and other agencies to investigate private companies pursuing training and hiring practices that conservative critics consider discriminatory against non-minority groups such as white men. Trump has called the programs, quote, discrimination, and insisted on restoring strictly, quote, merit-based hiring. The order will immediately gut Joe Biden's wide-ranging effort to embed diversity and inclusion practices in the federal workforce, the nation's largest at about 2.4 million people.
Moving our eyes over to Los Angeles now. Aerial drone footage shows the burnt landscape of Altadena, California, after fire crews were able to contain a big portion of the Eden fire, one of several wildfires that displaced Los Angeles County residents in January. And some of the same wildfire victims who lost their homes have now become volunteers in a remarkable outpouring of love for their suffering neighbors. Stan Jeter from the Global News Alliance has more.
As victims of the Los Angeles wildfires line up for help in this church parking lot,
and know that we've been praying for you all.
Volunteers load up the cars with essentials even as they cope with their own losses.
Our whole block had been burned. Our whole neighborhood, when we went back the very next day, had been burned, and fires were still blazing.
One Pasadena resident had just finished purchasing her house.
I paid off my house on January the 7th. The last payment hit the system, and my house burned down on January 8th. And financial blessings, people giving is definitely going to help us rebuild, because I can't sell my property.
These are people who have lost their homes. There are churches that have burned down to the ground. Their pastor has come to be with us, to pray with us, and to be here, to be hands and feet and to give to others as well.
As the fire approached her home, Tonita Fernandez says her kids were panicking, so she rushed them to safety.
And I was going to come back the next morning, but what I got instead was calls from neighbors and friends and family saying, oh, your house burned down.
Christian humanitarian organization World Vision has delivered truckloads of survival items to area churches for congregations to distribute to their own communities.
See the truck pulled up, 52-footer with tons of supplies for our community. It was such a blessing.
It's beautiful to see the church pulling together and offering our expertise, our resource, but helping hands. You know, early on, in moments like this, you just need practical, hands-on support.
And the victims turned volunteers are sharing a valuable lesson.
So even though we've lost everything, I want them to know that we can rebuild. And this is the beginning of rebuilding.
Stan Jeter, Global News Alliance.
Turning our eyes to the city of New Orleans now. Well, it can actually be called the city that has seen it all. A winter storm blanketed the Big Easy in fresh snow. To the west, the first ever blizzard unfolded in parts of Louisiana and Texas. Mid-city New Orleans recorded 9.5 inches of snow by Tuesday evening. Many roadways were impassable, classes were canceled in local schools, and many businesses could not open as snowfall essentially brought New Orleans to a standstill. The storm prompted the National Weather Service to issue the first ever blizzard warning for southwest Louisiana and southeast Texas. But for some residents in New Orleans, they made the best of this situation. Well, here's a man that took the opportunity to show off his hockey skills on an ice-covered Canal Street in the Big Easy there. And, well, check this out. A group of nuns and a priest ventured out into the white stuff and engaged in a friendly little snowball fight. Looks like they're having a lot of fun. I wonder if one of them threw a Hail Mary there. Well, here in southern Alberta, we don't have quite enough snow to start a snowball fight these days, but that could change real soon. I'll be back with a full look at the weather details coming up right after this short break. Well, with a high of 0 today, we're really sticking it to the man, because guess what? The average high for this time of year, -1, and we've been coming in a little bit higher than that the past couple days, and that trend will continue into Thursday as well as early next week. As we saw more or less wind today, that wind is going to return again on Thursday, 40 to 60 kilometer per hour wind gusts along with that +2-degree temperature. We're going to drop down to minuses on Friday, -3. And then -2 on Saturday, and then back up to +2 on Sunday, up to 14 degrees on Monday. That's where it's going to feel like springtime. And then back to 7 on Tuesday. So we're just sort of seeing this little bit of a warming trend here coming our way. -1, the average high for this time of year, like I mentioned, -13 average low. 16 was our record high on this day, happening back in 1942. And in 1943, Lethbridge saw its coldest on record, which was -39 on this day. Okay, 8:17, that's when the sun rose this morning. Sunset this afternoon at 5:10, so we're now seeing a couple minutes longer of sunlight rather today than we saw yesterday. So 8 hours, 53 minutes of daylight to be exact. Okay, in Victoria tomorrow, we're going to see a mix of sun and cloud in the morning, but 30% chance of showers by the afternoon, high of 6 degrees. 4 for the high in Vancouver with 40% afternoon showers there. Clear skies in Edmonton, high of 3 degrees. Clearing in Calgary with a high of 4 with 30 to 50 winds. As we look to the rest of the prairies, Saskatoon's going to see some snowfall, -4 for the high, mix of sun and cloud in Regina, -7 there. Sunshine in Winnipeg, but very cold, -17 the daytime high, but risk of frostbite with those wind chill factors dipping down into the -30s. Toronto seeing a 70% chance of flurries tomorrow, -6 for the high. Ottawa seeing 2 to 4 centimeters of snowfall, -7 there, -8 in Montreal with periods of light snow. As we look to Atlantic Canada, we're seeing 60% chance of flurries in Fredericton with a high of -9, 30% chance in Halifax, -3 there. -7 in Charlottetown tomorrow with a 60% chance of showers, flurries rather, as well there. And in St. John's, clear skies with a high of -6. So there you have it. That is your forecast. Amazon Canada says it will close all 7 of its Quebec warehouses and lay off nearly 2,000 staff over the next 2 months. The e-commerce giant positioned the move to provide, quote, even more savings to our customers over the long run, while dismissing concerns that it was linked to a recent unionization push in the province.
About 240 Amazon workers at the company's warehouse in the Montreal area unionized in May. Amazon challenged the union accreditation at the province's labor tribunal, but lost in October. The closure of the 7 Quebec facilities will mean Amazon will revert to a business model it used in Quebec up until 2020. That model employed local third-party companies for package deliveries. An Amazon spokesperson says the upcoming closures follow a review of the company's Quebec operations, adding that the decision was not made lightly.
Netflix finished 2024 with its biggest quarterly subscriber gain in history, thanks to the return of Squid Game, its first major live sporting events, and upcoming seasons of fan favorites. On Tuesday, Netflix said that nearly 19 million subscribers were added during the holiday, bringing its total global subscribers to over 300 million. Despite the massive subscriber gain, the cost is about to get more expensive for Canadians. Their cheapest plan with ads will go up by $2 to $7.99 per month. Its plan without ads will increase by $2.50 to $18.99, while the premium plan jumps by $3 to $23.99. The new prices take effect immediately for new subscribers, while existing members will see the change on their next bill. Something to look forward to there. Now here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was up 29 points on the day to finish at 25,311. The Dow was up 130 points to 44,156. The S&P 500 was up 37 points to 6086, and the Nasdaq was up 252 points to finish at 20,009. West Texas Intermediate oil was down 45 cents to 75.38 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 22 cents to $4 US. Gold was up $5.98 to $27.5020 US an ounce, and silver was up 8 cents at $30.82 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.55 per bushel, barley is at $6.57, canola is at $14.36, and corn is at $8.38 per bushel. Live cattle February contract was up $3 to $200.05. Feeder cattle were up $2.65 to $277.05. Lean hogs February contract was up 27 cents to 81.48, and the Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours at 69.60 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, tomorrow is the deadline for the Liberal leadership race. So far, candidates Mark Carney and Chandra Arya have submitted their paperwork to enter. The two appear to be the first through the gate, submitting their required signatures and a $50,000 deposit. Candidates have until Thursday at 5 p.m. to get their deposit in, along with a written nomination with signatures of 300 registered Liberals. Karina Gold and Chrystia Freeland have already announced that they are running, while 2 more candidates also declared their intention to enter the race today, including former Brampton MP Ruby Dalla and Michael Clark. Well, coming up after the break, with contention growing within Canada due to Trump's tariff threats, Alberta is looking to create a public body to purchase all private oil and gas intended for export to the U.S. According to legislative reporter Tyler Dawson, this would allegedly protect Alberta from the federal export tax. That full interview is next. And when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And you can visit our website anytime to check out a number of our stories and interviews.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is blaming Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for the 25% U.S. tariffs headed our way on February 1st. Smith says diplomacy is the way to go, not retaliatory tariffs. Well, joining us now is our legislative reporter and the National Post Alberta correspondent, Tyler Dawson. Your thoughts, Tyler? Diplomacy or retaliation?
Well, it seems like it's going to have to be both at some point. Okay. There seems to be a large-ranging consensus that there's going to need to be some sort of retaliation at some point if there are tariffs brought into effect. To give one example, Mark Carney, the Liberal leadership candidate, Edmonton boy, as it happens, grew up here, although it was born actually in the Northwest Territories. He said that retaliatory tariffs should be used to raise money to then support Canadian workers. So that's just one example of how those tariffs could potentially be used here. Now, Danielle Smith, as we've talked about on the program before, has been on this real charm offensive in the United States, going back to mid-November, late November, I think, was when she first met with all the Western governors in the U.S. She was at Mar-a-Lago a couple of weeks ago. She's been in Washington for the past several days, meeting with folks in the Capitol, and was supposed to attend the inauguration, but of course then it moved inside. So she was one of the unlucky ones, I think, that didn't get into the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building. But what's interesting is that Smith has sort of conceded that there's going to need to be some sort of retaliation, but is still really, really pushing on diplomacy. She's saying, look, we didn't get the day one tariffs. February 1st seems to be the date that Trump is now mulling around. We have this reprieve. We should really be talking about the benefits of free trade, how it enriches both Canadians and Americans, and try and reach some other solution. She's really shied away from retaliatory tariffs, especially on Alberta energy exports. And the reason I find that interesting is because she's very, very offside with almost every other political leader in the country. Pierre Poilievre has talked about how there needs to be retaliatory tariffs. The Prime Minister and the people around him have talked about it. The Liberal leadership candidates have talked about it. All the other premiers are on board with some sort of United Canada response. The only allies she's actually got especially on the Alberta energy front, is the Bloc Québécois, actually, who have spoken out with her and said there should not be surtaxes or something on Alberta energy. So a really interesting situation. Time's going to tell, I think, whose strategy is borne out. But Smith is putting, I think, a lot of political capital on this. And so I think it's really notable that she is very much in a different spot than other political leaders right now.
Well, isn't it fascinating? You bring up Blanchette with the Bloc Québécois. And I mean, he says it's actually absurd, to hold back our energy, our oil and gas and so forth, which is, pretty kind of bizarre coming from Quebec, right? But he's got a good point, I think, in the sense that he's arguing that, hey, you know what? If the U.S. in the meantime finds some other countries to supply their oil and gas, then it could potentially put Canada in a pretty weak negotiating place once we want to get back on exporting oil and gas to them. They're going, hey, we've already got some. So I understand where he's coming from.
No, absolutely. There's a bunch of different things happening. I mean, a lot of our oil goes to sort of the U.S. Midwest and to the Gulf Coast, where there's all these refineries that have been built or retrofitted to process sort of Alberta heavy crude. The U.S. doesn't really produce any of that, which is why they want ours. But they can get it from elsewhere if they need to. And maybe more to the point, and the real long-term risk, if you were to bring in some sort of export ban, is that those facilities will say, well, we'll just retrofit. We'll retrofit to process American crude. And then we actually wouldn't have anywhere to sell our oil. And that, I think, is why you're also seeing Alberta politicians talk a lot about, sort of reviving Energy East or reviving Northern Gateway or finding some other sort of points of export for Alberta oil to send overseas. And there is a market.
Oh, absolutely there is, yeah. I mean, I think that would be wisdom to do, but we'd have to refine some of our federal rules, wouldn't we? So
we would, and it would not be a fast process. I mean, no one's building a pipeline to Kitimat in the next 6 weeks or something.
Yeah, it's expensive and takes time. I mean, I think, I think it's important also to know your friends and adversaries. Okay, so and Trump is a little bit of both right now. But Danielle Smith points out that Trump doesn't respond well to threats. And I think she's right. He does seem to respond well when he's shown respect and when he's flattered, for that matter. So is there wisdom in what she's doing? She's obviously betting heavily on that, and I think she might be on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a good argument to be made that this situation calls for sort of a good cop, bad cop situation. Yeah. I think you're right. I don't think, even if it wasn't Donald Trump, we can't really bully the United States. Our economy is simply not that powerful. We are not that powerful. So I do think there has to be a good cop, bad cop, a carrot and a stick, however you want to frame it. So in that sense, I think there's probably some value. I mean, her critics are saying that, look, this is undermining the sort of pan-Canadian response. And, to use another example, we just talked about Yves-François Blanchet. Premier Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, who's a fairly reliable Alberta ally in sort of sticking it to Ottawa, has been more on board with sort of this pan-Canadian response. He was a signatory on a letter from the Council of the Federation last week that Danielle Smith did not sign. So I think you're right. I mean, I think that the risk that all Canadian politicians are making right now is to what extent can Donald Trump be appeased? Is this really about the border? Is this really about drugs? Is this really about migrants? Can the economic arguments sway him? Or is this an idea that he's become fixated upon and genuinely believes, and there's maybe no way to shake him off that? Again, time will tell, which is the worst analytical line you can use, but I just don't think we know if he is amenable to persuasion at this point.
Yeah, he's very unpredictable, and that gives him some sway, I guess, and it's just how he seems to operate. Now, again, he's been saying about our borders need to be secured, and I think that is true, regardless of any tariffs. So we need to do that, especially now with the tariffs, though, and as well as restricting fentanyl going across the border. And Smith, I think, makes a valid point too by saying that there has to be a major acceleration from Canada to meet the NATO requirement of 2% of GDP. And just to demonstrate to the U.S. that, we are a reliable partner in energy security. And, it's going to cost us some money. But I just, the way I view it anyway, just big picture going, okay, who is Trump? What's he going to respond to? I think that's probably wisdom as well, if we would do so.
Yeah, and the United States is obviously a pretty substantial seller of military equipment. So if we were to, start buying tanks or airplanes or something, good chance some of them would come from the United States, which of course, if we talk about this trade deficit that Donald Trump is concerned about, this idea that the U.S. is selling more to Canada than it's getting back, that a big expenditure on military materiel might sort of smooth that out a little bit. Of course, most of that trade deficit is due to oil and gas. If you factor out the oil and gas, the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Canada. And that is what it is. But I think the NATO commitment is going to be something we're going to hear a lot about. I think it's it's interesting to hear a provincial premier talking about it, of course, because it's not Danielle Smith or Rob Ford or Doug Ford, I should say, his jurisdiction. Which is neither here nor there, but I do think we're going to end up hearing a lot about that in the Liberal leadership race, and certainly in the election this time of year, some point this year, because it's not 100% clear what Pierre Poilievre plans to do on NATO spending. He's trying to he's talked a bit about reducing the size of government, reducing government expenditure, but of course, getting another 0.5% of GDP or whatever that exact figure is on military spending is going to be a substantial increase in spending out of Ottawa.
Well, it would be, yeah. They'll have to switch something around, some priorities around. So we'll see what he does with that. Certainly, I think there's a lot of bureaucracy that could be. You see that that's happening. I think in the States as well. They're getting rid of some long-time government employees, right? And maybe that needs to happen here in Canada as well. It's a huge cost to the system. So now, Premier Smith also suggesting that it might be helpful if the federal government repealed federal anti-energy policies, and again, maybe that would send a positive signal to Trump. I guess it's possible. It certainly wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, and I think the other way you're seeing a lot of economists talk about this right now is if we assume that we can't make Donald Trump happy, if we assume that tariffs are coming, well, what can Canada do to sort of weather that storm? I mean, part of this is the talk of retaliatory tariffs, but part of this certainly is trying to make Alberta and Canada and other provinces a more appealing investment jurisdiction. So, for example, that could be something like major project approvals, which of course happens through the Impact Assessment Act, which people better know as Bill C-69, which people better know as the No More Pipelines Bill. So you could potentially, if we're in the responding era, what might be some of those things that could change? You could certainly see some changes to corporate taxation or business tax rates. You could see some cuts to red tape. You could see some reform of some of this legislation that critics have argued make Canada an unattractive investment climate. Now, I think if Pierre Poilievre wins the next election, we're certainly going to see some changes on the environmental and project approvals front regardless, just because his party's been opposed to these things for a very long time. But there is this sort of, there's the retaliation thing, there's the diplomacy thing, and then underneath all of this is a bunch of eggheads and journalists sort of paying attention to what are some of the other things we might be able to do. And that's things like reducing interprovincial trade barriers and finding other export markets for our goods, not just energy, but other goods as well. And that sort of thing. So there's sort of multiple conversations happening all at once here. And I think you're right that we're going to see some of that other stuff, especially on some of the energy related legislation and infrastructure stuff that's going to come up for discussion.
Yeah. Well, and if we do happen to get some sort of, I know there's been talk of, special status for Alberta, and if we were to get that, on the tariffs, there's been talk of Prime Minister Trudeau placing an export tax on Alberta oil gas. That money's just going to go to Ottawa, right, and not to Alberta. So Alberta talking about potentially creating a public body that would buy all private oil and gas intended for export to the U.S., which apparently would protect Alberta somehow from the federal export tax, because I guess, one Canadian government can't tax another. Have you heard anything more on that at all? Is the Premier going to do that?
Well, I don't know for sure where they bounced the idea around, and I think Ted Morton, the former finance minister and a political science professor, I think has made a similar argument. My sense of that case is that it's not super clear cut. It is true that the government can't tax things twice, basically. It's less clear, I think, whether or not that would apply in this case, as in, does the Alberta government simply declaring all this oil is theirs, does that exempt them from federal taxation powers?
So it's maybe not as easy as it sounds. There have to be some hoops to jump through if that could potentially work. But
and certainly it's the sort of thing that'll end up in court. There's some precedent in terms of the carbon tax stuff on where jurisdiction ends and begins, and if it's a tax versus a levy, and yada yada yada. I would not surprise me to see some of these sort of attempts made by the Alberta government. I don't think it's clear cut that that's going to succeed. But then, you know what, from a political perspective in Alberta, that doesn't necessarily matter. Maybe from a business and economics perspective, that stuff really matters. But at least part of what Danielle Smith needs to do is to be seen standing up for Alberta's largest industry. So she doesn't need to win this case. It's the same with all the other court cases that the Alberta government has had over the years against the federal government. We don't need to. We didn't win the carbon tax case, right? But
the political posturing needs to be there, I think.
Exactly.
Fair enough. The voting, public needs to or wants to see that, I think. So now, if we could switch maybe from oil and gas to coal here. Now, the UCP, they lifted the moratorium. It was maybe done a bit quietly here on coal exploration in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. So you want to unpack that for us a bit here?
Yeah, so this is a big deal, I think. It's a big deal down your way too, because of the Grassy Mountain coal mine, I think, all that going on and concern about the watershed. So there's been a moratorium on sort of coal exploration and stuff like that on the eastern slope since I think 1976. It did obviously still happen a little bit, and back in I think it was 2020, Premier Jason Kenney lifted that moratorium and sort of opened the door to more coal exploration and stuff like that on the eastern slopes. And there's this huge blowback. And my sense at the time was that the Kenney government went, these urban environmentalists, they don't understand the realities of rural Alberta and why people want more development and things like that. And then of course it turned out that a lot of this blowback was actually from small town and rural Alberta. It was not eco activists in Edmonton who were, they were mad, but it was also the people that the UCP really wants to keep happy who are mad about this. So they switched that back. They stopped selling exploration leases and stuff like that. And the Alberta government has, for the last year or so, maybe 2 years, been kind of working on this new coal sort of consultation process, the new coal permit development process. They've been working on some sort of process on how a prospective developer would go into developing a coal mine. Those rules, that process are not done yet, but one of the things that they did do was lift this moratorium, the one that had been reimposed by the Kenney government. And so this has obviously been rather controversial among some of the folks who oppose this. Corb Lund, the country singer, who's been, one of the more prominent voices opposing coal exploration, has been tweeting about it. There's certainly been some concern that this, will not protect the eastern slopes in the way that certainly some people want. So
well, I think part of it too is, because there's again, $15 billion in, potentially having to be paid out to these companies, these large companies that have, had to pull back now. They've invested money. You promised us this, Alberta, now you're changing your mind, so we're losing money. So you got to reimburse us for that. And so it could be in response to that as well, because that money is going to be coming out from your pocket and my pocket, right? That's just reality. So.
Exactly, that sort of back and forth led these big companies to sue and say, yeah, we put all this money into trying to get this process underway. And so if they've changed the rules, they've maybe sort of blown the bottom out of that legal case is perhaps one of the reasons that this has happened.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see how this all plays out. And I got to keep it short because of time here, but you know what? Hearing back from some of the Southern Albertans here, talking about the Grassy Mountain coal mine, I mean, that is actually designed to make steel. So, which is a different perspective as well. That coal is going to be put into steel, and there are local First Nations tribes there that say, hey, you know what? We want the jobs, and we want some of the the spin-off money from the royalties and so forth from that, because it's on their land. So there's a lot of things going on here that it will be very interesting in the next few years here, I think. Hey, thanks so much for your time, Tyler. Been a good conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Tyler Dawson, our legislative reporter, and the National Post's Alberta correspondent. Have you noticed that Canada, and really I think most of Western society, has become a very divisive place? So the question is, why is that, and what can we do about it? Joining us today to chat about this and more is Alan Schleman. He's been a speaker and author with Stand to Reason Ministries since 2004. Alan is going to be one of the speakers at the annual Canadian Religious Freedom Summit, which will be taking place in Ottawa, February 1st from 1 till 5 at Metropolitan Bible Church. And it will also be streamed online. It is free to attend. However, contributions to cover the costs are welcomed and encouraged. And you do need to register first to watch online. Now, you can do that at freedomsummit.ca. And there are 3 other speakers as well: Dr. Carl Truman of Grove City College, Pastor Dwayne Klein with the Gospel Coalition Canada, and Professor Ian Provan from Regent College. So Alan, good to have you with us. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you, Paul. I look forward to our conversation today.
You bet. You're going to be speaking in person at the summit, and the overall theme is how did Canada and the U.S. arrive at their current disorienting state of identity politics? Man, there's just so many clashes, isn't there? And how should the church respond? So, Alan, how should we respond to this?
Yeah, well, you're right. This is an incredibly important question because so much of our society, as you're alluding to, has sort of lost their sense of who they are. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that's the case, and we could chat about that. But I think one of the most important things that we have to understand as we try to respond to that is to understand our own identity. And of course, the Bible makes it clear that if you're a follower of Jesus, you are an ambassador for Jesus Christ. This is what the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:20. And so as an ambassador for Jesus, we have to think of ourselves almost the way a political ambassador would consider themselves, speaking to people who don't necessarily share our values. And ambassadors want to always exemplify at least 2 things: truth and grace, right? We want to be able to communicate truth, but we want to do it in a graceful, compassionate, loving way. We want to be diplomatic. And so I think that should be the first thing that's in our mind that colors how we engage people.
Yeah, it should be. And I think, again, the vast majority of our viewers who are Christians, we know that's the right answer. But You know, it's easier said than done, isn't it, when it happens at work or wherever it is, you know. Now, your topic is going to be faith and identity. You touched on that, and also conversational tactics for controversial topics. So let me ask you this. Okay, so what would you say to someone, you know, walking down the street, if you got into a conversation on this issue? You know, what is their identity? What would you tell them? You know, who they might be, you know, questioning their own identity. I think that's often the case. So what would you say to them?
Sure. Well, as people who have been created by our Maker, I believe our Maker is the one who decides who we are, and so ultimately our identity and who we are is grounded in that. Now, if they're not a believer, they're still going to be a person who is made in God's image, right? There's still going to be a person who was created for a purpose. There's still going to be a person whose body is designed to function a certain way. It has we use this fancy word, teleology, which just means design or purpose. Right? So all of us are designed to function a certain way, and it's to know God and to be in fellowship with him. Now, of course, if they're not a believer, they're not going to necessarily accept that, but that is what our true identity is. And so, of course, I'd want to communicate that as I said, as truthfully, but as graciously and diplomatically as I could. And depending upon who that person is, it's going to affect how I'm going to engage them. And that's why you know, the title of my talk is going to be Conversational Tactics for Controversial Topics, because depending on who that person identifies, whether they identify as a Muslim or a person who's transgender or someone who identifies as lesbian, it's going to affect how I'm going to engage the person, because other topics or factors will weigh in on that conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for us as believers to fully realize that too, as we get into these conversations, that, you know, Christ lives inside of us. That is our identity. And that really changes the way we, from then on, you know, interact with others. What would Jesus say? How would he handle these situations, right? And you know what, I've noticed that in conversation with non-believers, when you actually share that God, you know, and again, you know, they're going, well, I don't know if there is a God, but, you know, if there is a God, would you consider that he's crazy in love with you, and your purpose is to actually relate to him on a daily, constant basis, always going back and forth, a conversation happening. He wants to be, you know, an integral part of your life. There's a level of intimacy there. And sometimes it gets kind of strange looks, but often it's kind of boy, that's really cool. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I totally agree. That is what God longs for. That's what we were created for. So I agree. This is the most important question. And I think partly because our society has jettisoned a belief in a maker, we no longer have a sense of, okay, well then if we don't have a maker, then who made us? And we can simply self-identify however we want. And of course, that's the problem. You combine that with the fact that we live in a very postmodern relativistic culture where truth is relative to ourselves, right? You decide who you are, I decide who I am. And so in the absence of a maker who has created us and defined who we are free to decide ourselves who we are, right? And as Carl Trueman, who is also going to be one of the speakers at the conference, has talked about, we've come to this place in society, and he talks about this concept of expressive individualism, where we now give total and complete authority to our inner thoughts, to our inner self. And so if our inner self feels like we are this way or that way, we give those thoughts 100% complete authority to define who we are. And of course, that's, that presumes that our inner thoughts are reliable. It presumes that our inner thoughts don't change, which of course we know they do. Our own self-perception changes. So would that mean our identity changes on a regular basis? And so this just shows you some of the problems with rejecting this concept that there is a maker who made us, who defines us, and then letting our own inner thoughts become the thing that defines who we are.
Yeah, and if it's like anything else, I guess things are made for a certain purpose. You know, if you look at a guitar and you use it as a sled instead, It's going to be
Yes.
abused, right? And it's not going to prosper in the thing for which it was created. And as human beings, of course, the same sort of thing happens when we get out of that purpose that we've been created for. It doesn't help us
Yeah.
in any way, right? So let me ask
Right.
you what maybe some do's and don'ts of communication when debating sexuality issues, right? That's often the case, that's what comes up. So where do we tend to mess up in those areas?
Well, when it comes to sexuality, if we're engaging another person about this, like they maybe identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, I think the thing that is the question in my mind when I'm engaging somebody with that is I ask myself, is this person a professing believer? Now, if my answer is no, they are not a professing believer, I actually don't necessarily try to argue with them about sexual ethics and the homosexuality or transgenderism per se, because in their mind, if they're not a believer, they're not going to consider the Bible an authority. They're not going to consider what God says relevant for them. So in actuality, if I'm engaging somebody who doesn't profess to be a believer, my initial impulse is to have a conversation about the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. I'm more interested first in having them come to know Jesus first, because when that happens, if that happens, then of course the Holy Spirit comes into their life, transforms them from the inside out, and now the Bible will be relevant for them, and they'll be able to consider, what does the Bible say about sexual ethics, about sexuality, about identity? Now, if the person is a professing believer, and again, we have people who are professing believers and yet still adopt gay identities, transgender identities. Well, now that person falls under the jurisdiction of Scripture. And what that means is then they are bound to adhere to what Scripture teaches. So if they're a professing believer and identifying as LGBT as well, then I'm going to use Scripture to weigh in on their particular situation, their identity, and whoever they are. So that's the initial question I'm asking myself when I'm talking to somebody who identifies as LGBT. Are they a professing believer or not? If they're not a professing believer, I'm presenting the gospel because that's what matters most importantly. And then if they become a believer, then I'm going to go with the identity questions. But if they're not but if they are a believer, then I'm going to, of course, use Scripture to weigh in on their situation.
Well, so the interesting thing is when talking about Scripture and LGBTQ issues, often you'll get the feedback, hey, Jesus himself didn't condemn any of this stuff, so, we're okay with it, and you should be too. How do you respond to that?
Okay, well, that's a great question. So actually, Jesus did condemn homosexuality. And now people say, well, that's impossible. And if you look at, oh gosh, now I'm going to forget the passage. I just wrote an article about this on our website, str.org. It's called Jesus Did Condemn Homosexuality. But I think it's in Mark. Oh, I'm going to forget the citation. But Jesus talks about how it's not what he talks about sexual immoralities, and he condemns sexual immoralities. Now, the Greek word for that word that's translated to English as sexual immorality is porneia, which is where we get the word like pornography from. But porneia, according to a Jew, would have been a reference to the sexual illicit behaviors that are mentioned in Leviticus 18.
Ah, okay.
And so if you look at Leviticus 18, of course, 22, one of the many sexual sins that is condemned there is homosexuality. And so when Jesus says, hey, you should not engage in these sexual immoralities, in these porneia, this is a reference to sexual sins that are identified in Leviticus 18, one of which is homosexuality. So in actuality, Jesus, in a very significant way, did condemn homosexuality as well as adultery and bestiality and all the other sins that are mentioned in Leviticus 18. Now, that's just one thing to consider. But even if Jesus said nothing about specifically homosexuality, even I didn't mention what I just said a minute ago, the fact of the matter is that the red letters of the Bible are not the only letters in the Bible that are the inspired word of God. The entire corpus of Scripture is the inspired word of God. And we see all from, we see both in Old and New Testaments that the Bible does condemn homosexual sex, homosexual behavior.
Yeah, and when Jesus says when the New Testament talks about Jesus being the Word, right? That's including Old Testament and New Testament. I mean,
yes, of course.
I mean, yeah. I mean, he's not going to disagree with himself. He is truth. He is the Word. So it just makes sense to put those all together, right? I mean, at least in my view.
Yes.
May I ask, would it be inappropriate in conversation with, somebody who's trans to bring up the fact that many doctors view gender dysphoria as a mental disorder that requires, it would require treatment rather than affirmation, right? I mean, or does that automatically put up a wall? Should we stay away from that sort of thing?
Well, it certainly will probably. I mean, everybody's different. But in a lot of cases, yes, people are going to be kind of resistant to that, especially if you start to refer to it as disorder right off the bat. However, if the person, again, is not a believer, I would probably actually point to a lot of the secular literature, as you're kind of alluding to, Paul, the scientific literature that's showing that gender identity, this whole concept, is pseudoscience. And what I mean by pseudoscience is that it purports to be scientific, but in actuality, it's not scientific at all. And the most significant people today who are arguing against transgender ideology are actually not even Christians. There's a ton of atheists, evolutionists, evolutionary biologists who are saying, look, this goes against evolution. It goes against what we know about science. It goes against what we know about the sexual binary that we've known for over 100 years. I mean, in terms of scientifically, of course, we've known males and females are the only two for all of human history. But in terms of how we've understood that scientifically, all throughout the last 100 years where we've understood this concept of male and female, this transgender ideology flies against that.
It doesn't have a lot of, common sense to it, like I say, even to, people who aren't religious, right? So I got to leave it there, Alan, because we're running out of time. But just briefly, any final thoughts on how we should respond to those who are strongly opposed to our worldview? I mean, you mentioned it earlier, I think, and that is, I guess it's how we respond, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of Christians do know the truth, but we have to learn how to communicate that in a compassionate, loving, gracious, and winsome manner. And that's specifically what I'm going to be talking about at the conference is conversational tactics that we can employ that communicate truth without compromising it, but doing it in a compassionate and gracious way.
Yeah, they need to know that we care for them, right? Otherwise, they don't care what you have to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're ambassadors for Jesus, so we represent Christ.
Yeah,
so that's
let your light shine. Yeah, be Jesus. Thanks so much for being with us today, Alan. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
You bet. Alan Schleman is a speaker and author with Stand to Reason Ministries, str.org. I encourage you to check it out. Alan is going to be one of the speakers at the Canadian Religious Freedom Summit in Ottawa, February 1st, at Metropolitan Bible Church. You can attend in person, and it'll also be streamed online. Simply register at freedomsummit.ca. I'm Paul Arthur. On behalf of all of us at Bridge City News, thanks so much for watching.